Hello, folks. My name is Frank Ramos. I'm the Senior Solutions Architect over here at Ground Labs North America. And today we're going to be covering data protection for manufacturing. So in this talk, I'll cover how organizations can evolve their data protection practices for privacy compliance and data security in line with standards such as PCI DSS, GDPR, and even protecting intellectual property in a world of exponential data growth and increasingly complex technical environments. I'll cover the benefits of adopting an evidence-based approach in a continuous process of data identification, verification, and remediation. We'll go over how that forms the foundation for effective data protection compliance with global privacy legislation and security standards. Before we get into that, though, it's worth taking a look at why this matters and how challenges we face managing vast quantities of data came to be in the first place. All right, so before we get into the details of philosophical data theory and regulatory data management, I have a little side thought to open up the rabbit hole a little. Are there any gearheads out there, any auto enthusiasts? As much as I love the data protection industry, and I sort of love the battle. I read an article about, maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it just blew my mind. It was an article on a very large auto manufacturer applying for a patent to be able to disable vehicles if folks don't make their car payments or their vehicle payments. And I thought, man, that's kind of brutal, right? I get it, but I'm like, to be able to enforce that. And then I went a little further and I'm like, well, wait a second. If they're going to be able to do that and everybody's going towards self-driving cars, then it would stand to reason that at some point they'll be able to check the vehicle remotely to see if anybody's in there. And if nobody's in there, to be able to repossess the car remotely. And I just thought, man, that's just crazy, right? This world of ours has just gotten really bizarre. And then I was thinking, well, we're talking about a vehicle. We're talking about sensitive data related to vehicles, which of course is a manufactured piece of equipment. And I thought, man, this is really some interesting stuff, and just how far and wide that data protection really needs to take a role. Because at some point, if somebody were to be able to get access codes to grab vehicles, and of course, sure, we could maybe disable the GPS and, maybe bring vehicles to chop shops. So I just feel like, we're at the very infant level of this whole data protection thing. But, that's the modern stuff, right? Like I said, that was an article that I had read probably 3 weeks ago. And for as long as there have been computers, there have been data breaches. Even the first electronic computer, Colossus, was actually invented with the specific task of helping British code breakers decrypt messages during wartime. It's kind of crazy how many current technological advancements have originated from recycled tech solutions of the past. And still, despite our best efforts, breaches continue to make headlines on a daily basis. Many of these result in a loss or theft of personal information. Everything from email addresses, credentials, credit cards, health information, and other sensitive personal data like intellectual property, right? So, company secrets. Now, we operate in a world of increasing privacy and data protection legislation. This is the result of damage caused to individuals when their information was stolen and abused following a data breach. With more states legislating new privacy and data protection laws and potential of a federal act, actually it's called the ADPPA, it's a Federal American Data Privacy and Protection Act, it's important that businesses across industries, including manufacturing, understand their actual obligations to protect data, as well as complying with local and federal laws Many businesses are going to need to comply with legislations other than their local laws and regulations that apply, for example, across border to the U.S. For organizations such as Europe's GDPR. And with security standards such as PCI DSS constantly nipping at our heels, that's something that we also need to be aware of and we need to protect for. And that's actually where a lot of this originated, or at least a starting point in the early days. But it's gone way beyond that. And the reality is these legal efforts are both a blessing and a burden, because at some point somebody actually has to be responsible for maintaining that compliance. Now, the compliance burdens can seem insurmountable. Most data protection and privacy regulations share these common principles. One, there must be a legitimate need to process the data. The second is the data has to be accurate, complete, and it has to be kept up to date. And the third common denominator is the data must be protected against deliberate misuse, loss, theft, or in some situations, destruction. We're seeing a new principle of data minimization, basically capturing only the data that's absolutely necessary for the purpose it's being collected. It's this final principle, or rather how historic practices make this incredibly challenging for modern organizations. We're going to explore that next. Here's a little history, statistics, and some digital numbers to put some things into perspective. In 2021, approximately 79 zettabytes of data were generated worldwide. By 2025, this figure is expected to exceed 180 zettabytes. If we consider that a portion of this is retained, the volume of stored data is growing at a compound rate of about 19.2% per year. So for those of you that are wondering what the heck a zettabyte is, there you go. There's a nice, easy to read chart for you guys to figure out the math on. For the rest of us, we're going to go ahead and put that away. Now, historically, organizations, not just businesses of any flavor and every flavor, have collected and retained data without much control over what they were collecting and why. You need to understand that most of this wasn't done with malicious intent. Nobody was trying to collect just for bad purposes. As a matter of fact, data was useful, and it made sense to keep hold of information you might need to use again someday in the future. Think data mining, or that migration that you wanted to keep the original data just in case. How about old VMs or backups someone's kept on ice in case of emergency? Those examples are as common as someone eating dinner. In order to be fair, since I just gave some of intentional data retention, how about unintentional, uncontrolled data propagation? I can give you a ton of examples, but I really need to keep this related to your day-to-day life as a manufacturer. So here's a few questions for you to ask about yourself, or perhaps the folks that you work with on a day-to-day basis. What do you manufacture, and what's important to that process? Do you have secret formulas? How about component sources and pricing? Is that important? Or maybe purchase orders with sensitive information. Where does that information wind up when we unintentionally let go of that data? Do you guys destroy your order, PO, or shipping records based on data retention policies? Maybe you don't need to. What I do know is if it's important to protect PII data according to legislative requirements, you might as well be protecting your sensitive business data and intellectual property along that road, along the way. So those organizations were and continue operating in an environment where the cost of data storage was decreasing all the time. Unfortunately, the ability to analyze that data was in its infancy. Collecting more of it meant a greater chance of having what you needed when you need it. So as the cost of data storage decreased, there was no real incentive to clean up and manage that data, so businesses just created vast data lakes and just kept pushing it out and growing and growing and growing. Well, as these grew, they had less and less visibility of this data and increasingly limited awareness of where it actually was, how it was being used, and how far it had actually traveled or been distributed. All right, so here's the deal. Over the last 3 years, we've experienced changes within organizations that were completely unexpected, and they certainly weren't planned. That, I think, just about all of us can agree on. As a result of the enforced lockdowns and the need to shift operations from offices to homes, digital transformation programs that were planned and staged for delivery over years were now being accelerated to complete in a matter of months. So as these organizations and businesses outsource more of their environments through MSPs and cloud services, their supply chains have become more complex and their data even more widely distributed. Well, because organizations have grown to support their clients and customers, they've inadvertently collected vast amounts of high-risk data. So over time, they've lost visibility and insight to much of this as their environments just keep continuing to shift with modern technologies. Essentially, nobody's doing cleanup. Once upon a time, not so long ago, a large telco was undergoing an independent security assessment. The client was driving where and what they wanted the assessors to focus their efforts on. The assessors, they wanted some more accounting and finance reconciliation systems assessed. The IT and security teams said, no, you're wasting your time, and the assessors insisted. In the end, over 100 million findings of customer PII were identified. This was all due to a bank uploading statement files that included details of the customers who had paid them. So there's a few takeaways from this particular story, and they're actually much more common than most people realize. The first thing is there is a lot of people involved when it comes to finding sensitive data. There's a lot of people involved in assessments. And in this case, not everybody was on the same page. You're always going to run into that. That is pretty much standard business practices, is for people to be on opposing sides of managing private information or sensitive data. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that this data, these 100 million findings of PII, weren't even theirs. They weren't even the ones generating the data. So they were completely unaware of it. So in the grand scheme of things, this is why searching and hunting that sensitive data throughout your entire ecosystem is absolutely critical. You just literally, as the old saying goes, you don't know what you don't know. Okay. So at this point, you might be thinking, well, that doesn't apply to us. That doesn't apply to my company. That was a telco. Okay, I'll tell you what. Google toy manufacturer data breach, and then get back to me. That's right, folks. Kids' toys. U.S. manufacturing and utility businesses leaked nearly 38 million records, and that was in 136 breaches in 2022. Over the last 3 years, just U.S. businesses alone, specifically in manufacturing and utilities, have suffered 562 breaches, affecting around 91 million records. So here's the crux of the solution. Effective data management starts with data awareness. So you ask yourself, well, how do we build data awareness? Well, data awareness is understanding the data that you have, where it is, how it got there, and why you actually have it. The foundation of this approach is to identify both data held by the organization and the information it needs to fulfill its goals. The verification step evaluates data assets to determine their purpose and value to the company. This helps businesses to understand the information that's essential to them and enables them to dispose of the data that doesn't serve any specific purpose. The business needs to concentrate resources, budget, and effort to protecting its data through applying controls and remediating weaknesses and failures. So if you don't need the data, you've got to make those determinations. And the only way that you can do it is by identifying it and then understanding what's going on. So the CIA triad that we're all familiar with, which is confidentiality, integrity, and availability, the only way you're going to be able to get there is by identifying, verifying, and then protecting that data. So once we've identified and verified the data, we can apply these principles to define and apply controls to manage and protect that data. It does depend on its sensitivity. Maybe it's, just fundamental data that's just helping you statistically. Sure, no big deal. But if it starts to encroach into that sensitive realm, at least you know where it is and you can manage it appropriately. Forget about the data that you actually need to function on a day-to-day basis. I mean, you have to understand that a bad actor is going to be patient. They don't want one record. One record does them no good whatsoever. They either want to find business critical information that they can crypto lock and then, hold you ransom. So now you're paying money to literally keep your business in operation, or they're looking for data that they can sell on an open market. So based on industry standards and security frameworks, you're going to cover most of that with the IT side as far as penetration goes. But remember, these guys are doing it for very different purposes, and that's where you have to protect that sensitive data. So keeping that in mind, it's a simple process. Identify the data, verify whether you need it or don't, and then protect it if you need it. All right, so identifying data with evidence. One of the biggest challenges organizations face in managing their data is getting a clear view of the data they have within their business. Many organizations start this process of data discovery by mapping a data flow diagram, but this only tells a little part of the story. We're all familiar with using data flow diagrams to explain how data moves through business processes and systems. Data flow diagrams, they're a useful tool to understand what we think or how data flows were designed. We know about the data within the organization and where we expect to find the data, right? Data flow diagrams show us this design, they show us the processes, and they show us how the data is intended to move between systems, teams, and third parties. However, data flow diagrams are based on assumptions and intended design. They're only part of the picture. Organizations who apply controls and processes to manage data based on data flow diagrams believe they have a well-managed data environment. It's impervious. They know where their data is and have put the necessary controls in place to protect it. They've worked with the appropriate teams. What data flow diagrams can't illustrate is the data you don't know you have. The unknown, right? We just heard an example of bank account drops. So in reality, if they performed an evidence-based discovery, they would find data in places they don't expect. Think of report writers. These guys, depending on how you do your reports, they may extract some data from a database. They may massage it a little bit with Excel, Power BI, Tableau, do their output, and then just leave that data sitting in some folder or some temp folder on the machine. Well, this is what happens when processes or systems fail. Systems are too slow to meet performance targets or when tasks are too erroneous. So people will find workarounds to get the job done. We've already talked about issues of legacy data storage, but there are also reservoirs of data resulting from poor decommissioning of systems. We mentioned earlier about virtual machines. And then, of course, rapid migration to newer technologies that result in unintended duplication that may be never addressed. So an evidence-based approach to data awareness should have a handful of things in place. It should be configurable for a wide range of data types and formats. The reality is it should be able to get into just about anything. It's got to be compatible across on-prem and cloud environments, platforms, and systems. You really need to be able to inspect and interrogate your entire ecosystem. If you can't, then you're going to leave data out there, and somebody will figure out a way to get to it. You also need to be able to identify data in email and image-based sources, PDFs, screenshots, things like that. I know folks are notorious for temporarily screenshotting sensitive information so that they can look it up real quick and then they just forget about it. You also need to be able to inspect structured and unstructured data repositories. So databases definitely need to be in scope, even if it's just from a second look perspective. You need to be able to ensure that either the data that should be in there is in there and that it's well protected, or if stuff shouldn't be in there. If sensitive data or toxic data is just lingering around a database waiting to be compromised, you need to be aware of that and put the appropriate checks and balances in place. And then you also need to be able to delegate some of those remediation tasks. So perhaps, your team is small. Well, you're going to need to be able to invoke some cultural changes first, and then ultimately be able to ensure that the remediation tasks are being completed by potentially the users that need to clean that data up. All right, then verifying data with purpose. So what are the things you have to understand after you've found that data, after you've done a little bit of evaluation on that, is that this step is about understanding what information is important to the teams you work with. Unless you're under incredibly strict guidelines, which oftentimes is the case, you're still going to need to evaluate that data and work with others in order to ensure that you're properly managing that data, because you may get rid of data that's essential to them, right? There are de-identification processes that you can put in place that still enable most of the data to be useful, and it just renders the sensitive data or toxic data harmless or reduces that level of toxicity. And then at that point, then you can determine the proper disposal of the data that doesn't serve any specific purpose. So it also helps as you're going through this process to determine the priorities of any remediations that you're going to put in place. So if you have more critical or sensitive data or more vulnerable assets, you can prioritize those. All right, so let's round this off with some final thoughts to make this a really complete process and sort of a complete package. Once you've identified and verified, then evaluated and understood the data that's valuable to your organization and the data that's high risk, such as personal information, you can now manage that data in an informed position. You'll know what to get rid of, what to capture, and what not to capture. You'll learn what data will need additional protection. This is how you can build a framework for re-engineering those processes, updating systems, and applying controls that we're familiar with. It also establishes a baseline for data strategy, which will define the data that you'll have, how it'll be used, and how you'll manage it throughout the data lifecycle to the point of disposal. This process is definitely not a one-and-done deal. You absolutely, no matter what, need to keep this in mind. There is going to be a need to have recurring conversations about data management and strategy as part of a holistic protection solution. The other thing is, if you wash, rinse, and repeat on this as you're going through that process and through those steps, you're going to learn more and more. You're going to learn where your friction points are, including, dealing with cultural changes where you can isolate that and you can target a lot better. Nancy's department, Steve's department, those guys don't seem to cooperate, and they should not have this type of data available on their network shares, in their email boxes, or on their desktops. So, the first time you do this, it's going to be overwhelming. But as you repeat the process over and over again, you're going to be able to start to shrink the target, ultimately bringing protection and a solution that you can put in place, as well as gaining adoption of your peers and colleagues. So the identify, verify, protect cycle is one of continuous review and improvement. Companies are always ingesting new information every day, or they're exporting new information every day. New threats are constantly emerging on a regular basis. We all know that. We read the news. And new legislation is always going to impose new challenges on the way that we store that data and the way that we secure that data. Understanding where your organization's data lives should be an ongoing process. The other thing to be aware of is that automation of this process is going to be pretty critical. Since there's neither the time nor the resources available to support frequent data inventory reviews, not only can automation ensure that you know where the data is, but it also supports rapid remediation and the management of rogue data and newly identified data repositories. Automation typically delivers standardized reporting, as well as milestones that can be analyzed and interpreted to monitor and measure data risks, providing evidence for audits and assessments, security certifications, and regulatory compliance. All right, so a quick recap of what we've covered today, mainly the salient points. Historical data collection and rapid digital transformation are the nightmare that have contributed to those growing data volumes and led to excessive storage. We need to eliminate assumptions about data with an evidence-based approach. We need to actually see what's going on in our environments. We need to be able to take a look at it and be able to manage that after identifying the data that's important to us, whether it be important for our business continuity or important from a perspective of having a level of toxicity where we want to protect our organization from breaches and ransomware and things like that. We need to be able to evaluate and verify that data. That way, we're understanding what's important to the organization, to business units, to, again, business continuity, right? Verify that that data is either useful, useless, or toxic. Finally, we need to be able to protect that data based on its levels of sensitivity, and we need to be able to dispose of it properly if it's no longer needed. Finally, the most important part of today's conversation, at Ground Labs, we have the tools to help you guys achieve understanding and controlling of your data. We accomplish this across the platforms that contribute to perpetuating the life cycle and escalation of the data toxicity that you guys are having challenges with. We offer solutions to help you solve your data sprawling and propagation frustration, and we can help you manage that data before somebody else helps themselves to it. So if you'd like to learn a little bit more about our products, let me show you how to do that. What you're going to want to do is you're going to want to go to groundlabs.com. You're going to choose book a demo, or you can contact us via other mechanisms on the website, including chat with an expert. And at that point, if you book a demo, just let them know that Frank sent you, and perhaps yours truly will be able to do that demo and work with you and help you guys find a solution that meets the needs of your challenges. All right, and at that point, I'd like to thank you guys for attending, and if there's any questions, please feel free to put those in the chat box, and we'll go ahead and do our best to answer those right now. Thanks.